Greetings and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Badgelan, in for Jason Miles tonight, who is taking a well-earned rest. Now, before we begin with our show today, I want to remind everybody to like and subscribe. Your likes and your subscriptions really help us in the algorithm. There's also the bell, apparently, that works, I'm told. Leave a comment. Jason reads all your comments and gets very angry when you send him mean comments. So, send the mean comments because that is excellent conversation material for us. In addition, if you have the means and you enjoy the content, please consider becoming a patron and help us keep producing the interviews we do here at This is Revolution. Now, for this episode, we're going to be discussing Syria, the recent earthquake, the civil war, and the political changes that are taking place in the region and how that is affecting the state of play in Syria, which has been in a state of civil war for over a decade. And I'm joined today by Alex McKeever, who is a freelance journalist. He works on Syria. He's worked with several organizations, including Truth and Justice, working on Syrian human rights. He's a graduate of the CUNY Grad Center of Middle Eastern Studies, and he's also a part-time mover of things as well, as he's based in New York. So I would like to welcome Alex to the show. Hello, Alex. How are you doing?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me, Gene. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm really great. I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk to you about the Syrian civil war because obviously there's a lot of information, there's a lot of narratives, there's a lot of people say a lot of things about Syria, and it is a very complicated civil war. I mean, all civil wars are complicated, but it isn't just one side versus another side. It's there are multiple different factions. There are international powers involved: Russia, the United States, also Turkey, the Arab countries, all have a stake in Syria. And in certain ways, this heavy regional involvement has perpetuated this conflict for more than a decade. And of course, recently, Syria was struck by an earthquake. The epicenter of that earthquake was in Turkey, but of course, the affected regions included parts of Syria, which of course, suffer from, not only the earthquake, but also the lack of preparedness because of the civil war, the sanctions, the, lack of materials. So there's a, heavy human toll of that earthquake. So I thought we might begin our discussion tonight by talking about the earthquake and what has been happening with the earthquake, how that's affected Syrian politics, how the response has been. What are your impressions?
Yeah, so the earthquake occurred on February 6th at like 4 in the morning, 4:17, I believe. And, the epicenter was in Turkey, in Marash, in like central southern Turkey, and immediately had massive effects within Syria, primarily within the northwest, in areas controlled by the opposition and as well by the regime. So, and the opposition, I mean, to immediately jump into how the country is divided, the opposition territories are divided into two different statelets. One is controlled by the group Tahrir Sham, or HTS, which is formerly was Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate within Syria, and is now the situation's a bit complicated there. We can get into that later, maybe. And then the other part of opposition-controlled Syria is directly, basically, controlled by Turkey. You have Turkish military deployed there. You have various Turkish ministries, different government bodies there. So that the opposition areas were the most affected by the earthquake. In Idlib, that had the biggest death toll altogether. Various towns and cities along the border there, and then the city itself that had the most deaths within opposition-controlled territory was Jandiris, which is within Afrin, the historically Kurdish-controlled area, or Kurdish-populated area that was taken over by Turkey in 2018. So those were the two biggest or most affected areas, and then regime territories within Latakia province and within Aleppo, uh, particularly Aleppo city, were also affected. Altogether, about 5,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and thousands more injured. With thousands of buildings collapsed, and yeah, so it was devastated, and this was exacerbated by the economic and political conditions within the country itself. So areas that are under government control are, the Syrian regime is under sanctions by most of the international community, led by the U.S. and UK and EU. Um, so that has some effects on relief, though there are aid carve outs, and pretty quickly the Damascus was receiving fights, particularly from a lot of Arab countries as well as from the UN, because relief through the UN goes to the government of any country. So it got a lot of aid from the UN. In the northwest, in the areas that are under opposition slash Turkish control, these areas really did not receive much aid at all the first couple of days. Part of this was affected by the damage to Turkish infrastructure. So the main road that leads to the main border crossing from Turkey into Syria, into Idlib, that road itself was, sections of it were greatly damaged by the earthquake. And then there's also the issue of aid, UN aid, going into opposition controlled areas. Initially, there was an agreement years ago between, the West, Russia, etc., to allow for multiple crossings of aid, from Turkey and also from Iraq into non-government controlled areas, including some to Kurdish controlled areas in the northeast. Over the years, Russia has used its Security Council veto and as a permanent member to whittle these down to just one crossing. And so several weeks later, the Russia and the Syrian regime okayed the opening of other crossings, but overall, aid's been quite limited into these areas. And
So,
yeah.
sort of the general picture that we see is that these rebel-held areas were the most affected, and also had the slowest aid response because of the complicated international and legal status of these regions, and of course, because the main regional patron of these regions, Turkey, had its own internal crisis to deal with as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say.
And I should probably also add that these regions are also some of the regions that have seen some of the most fierce fighting during the Civil War as well. So obviously that sort of adds on top of the sort of infrastructural problems that they're facing as well. It's also regions that have been like in constant turmoil all throughout the Civil War. So what has been the political fallout of this earthquake? Are there openings with the opposition? Is aid going through, and is that opening the door for perhaps some kind of reconciliation, or is the status quo still kind of just on the remaining as it was before, with a kind of brief, to use an analogy, a football game at Christmas, like in the First World War, British and German soldiers played football for Christmas Day and then went back to fighting each other? Is this just a brief kind of hiatus? What's the political outcome of this? Will it change anything?
So for the last several years, the conflict's been largely frozen. So I don't. The World War One analogy doesn't necessarily make too much sense. What you do have is sort of random bombardment, going back and forth at different times, particularly coming from the regime and Russian side. But I'd say the largest political development has been the sending of aid by a lot of the Arab countries to the regime, and this has sort of facilitated what was already a slowly developing sort of what appears to be a rapprochement that's in its earliest phases. So initially, before the earthquake, this was being led by the UAE, and Jordan to a lesser extent, but Jordan's obviously doesn't have the same weight that the UAE does. But since the earthquake, you saw Saudi send its first flights to Damascus since 2011. And actually, in the last week, Saudi has announced that it's inviting, or it's been reported at least, that Saudi is inviting Syria to the Arab League summit in May. So this is, I'd say, that the biggest political development that's occurred following the earthquake is it's given sort of an excuse, or it's kickstarted this nascent normalization of Assad from the Arab League side.
And this was already happening before the earthquake. So the earthquake hasn't so much changed the trajectory of the posture of Arab countries towards Assad, but rather perhaps served as an accelerant for a kind of thawing in relations and at least normalization and sort of reintegrating Syria into the greater Arab political community?
So it's a little difficult to say because the different Arab countries have taken different approaches. Jordan was the first one to really reach out to the regime because after the Syrian government and Russia took back the entirety of opposition-controlled territories within southern Syria, the border was opened with Jordan eventually, and trade began again to some capacity between Jordan and the regime. And yeah, so, and then the UAE has begun that process too. But I do think I wouldn't see it as necessarily one unified bloc. I think countries are sort of following their own rationales. I think now that Saudi is reaching out and engaging in this process, that might put more weight behind it in terms of the entire Arab League. But
So,
yeah.
how has Saudi's position then shifted over the long term towards the Assad regime? So it was one of the Arab countries that was most hostile to Assad, would you say, and now is perhaps heading towards normalization?
So yeah, initially it was one of the main backers of the opposition, along with Turkey and with Qatar,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually the United States, and Jordan to a lesser extent. But Turkey and Qatar were always working with similar groups, big fans of the Muslim Brotherhood, and we're riding high on what had occurred in Egypt and Tunisia in 2011, and
Mm-hmm.
saw Syria as another opportunity to install a government that was aligned with them. So initially, Saudi also was involved heavily because I think largely because of Iran,
Mm-hmm.
and just like the opportunity to possibly install a favorable regime, favorable government in Syria. And then, as by 2013, 2014, when you start having, what people say, like the Arab winter or whatever, when Morsi's overthrown in Egypt and Saudi starts sort of cooling down its support. And then by 2016, it's largely cut ties with the opposition, or it's no longer a primary backer. It really became Turkey and Qatar.
So Turkey and Qatar are still backing the opposition.
Yeah.
How is this affecting their relationship with the Assad regime?
So Qatar, as far as I know, has not normalized any tie, or has not even engaged in this sort of outreach. Turkey, though, over the last year has flirted with the idea of rapprochement, and this largely comes through efforts facilitated by the Russians. Russia and Turkey have this transactional relationship where over the last several years, Putin and Erdogan, I think in ways it's very sort of personalized between Putin and Erdogan. So Turkey, the Erdogan's government over the last 8 months or so has been talking about trying to reach some sort of rapprochement with Damascus. And there's been some meetings, and there's going to be more meetings in the future, and Iran's been tied into this as well. But in terms of the earthquake, I don't think the earthquake necessarily. I think there's bigger factors at play when it comes to Turkey and Syria. I mean, this does possibly mean that Turkey's less likely to take a more aggressive role in Syria, just because the capacity's damaged to some degree. But overall, I think the main things, Turkey has its own domestic issues, particularly how unpopular Syrian refugees have become, and then also the PKK war. These are really guiding Turkish policy.
So the earthquake is not the core of this rapprochement that's taking place. Would you say it comes out of the kind of stalemate that has existed in Syria since about 2016, 2017?
Yeah, I mean, I think Turkish policy has shifted over the last 12 years dramatically, particularly in 2016. You had a couple of events that happened in 2015, 2016. You had the collapse of the peace process with the PKK. You had Russia's direct intervention in Syria in October and November 2015. And then you had the coup attempt in the middle of 2016. And from that point, Turkey switched from, pursuing regime change, as I said earlier, riding high on the Arab Spring and the success of the Muslim Brotherhood in some countries. I don't want to, say that the Arab Spring was a Muslim Brotherhood.
They were able to, let's say, reap the fruits of the Arab Spring.
Yeah,
they
in
were the best
countries.
In certain countries, they were the most best placed group to take advantage of that discontent.
Yeah, and they, had decades of organizing, very strong capacity, etc. Anyway, so in 2016, Turkey's policy shifts to pursuing two goals. One is to essentially destroy the political project, the Rojava political project, the PYD, YPG, all the acronyms, etc. The Kurdish autonomy in Syria, basically. And the second goal has been to prevent another influx of refugees and to create a safe zone within northern Syria where it can slowly start to deport refugees into. Because the refugee issue has become like a real hot topic, threatened Erdogan's alliance that he's been in with the nationalists since around this period.
Yeah, because there are between 3 and 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and obviously, as one might expect, there are nationalist sections of the Turkish electorate who are increasingly hostile to these refugees, and that's definitely become, as you say, a hot button issue inside Turkish politics. Well, we've talked about some of the other, some of the big powers, regional powers, and their interest in Syria. But what about the United States and Russia specifically? I mean, the two major, extra regional players in Syria at the moment. What kind of shifts are we seeing in their policies? I mean, is Russia, in the light of the Ukraine war, is it having to retrench its interest in Syria? Is the United States going to shift its policy anytime soon on Syria? I mean, what is even America's policy on Syria? Because it seems often completely at odds with itself in terms of its Syrian policy.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with Russia because that's a little bit simpler. Russia's been invested since 2011 in protecting the Assad regime and preventing its collapse. And, this is dictated by, there's several factors at play. Part of its prestige, maintaining allies within the region. It has expanded, or it has essentially permanent military bases and the port in Tartus. So it's gained from that. And yeah, so Russia is heavily invested in the success and the survival of the regime. Though I think it is a little bit more willing to compromise than the regime itself. Russia has, in the past, facilitated reconciliation deals with former opposition groups and brought them under the auspices of the regime, under the Syrian Arab Army. This process has been a little bit piecemeal, and in the southern province of Daraa, there's all these reconciled groups there, and it has been sort of a security nightmare to some degree. There's like a small scale insurgency and etc. But the area is no longer formally under the control of the opposition. Anyway, that's just to say that Russia is willing to sort of come to some sort of political solution with opposition groups in a way that the regime tends not to, because the regime is very inflexible. So yeah, that's Russia's interest in Syria. And so it intervened directly in 2015, and this partially through the success of their counterinsurgency campaign, partially through them entering directly, discouraging other countries from remaining invested in the opposition. Through this, the Syrian regime was able to capture large portions of the country. It currently controls the majority of the country. But Russia's military presence was always somewhat limited. It was an air war. They had some special ops on the ground. They had the Wagner group. So it wasn't like Russia deployed large numbers of its military to Syria to engage in the war. And especially since 2018, apparently the Russians have really drawn down. So the military presence itself is even more limited now. But what's important is the political and diplomatic presence that it has. And if Turkey wanted to maybe like go into all out war with Russia and try to take out the regime, like maybe Russia would back down or something. But that doesn't seem like anything that's going to happen. So yeah, that's Russia. The U.S. initially, I think there's some confusion on this. There's basically two U.S. interventions in Syria. There was the CIA Operation Timber Sycamore, that was backing opposition factions, and this was done in conjunction with Turkey and Qatar and Saudi and Jordan. And so that was basically a lot of it was arming these certain groups with anti-tank missiles.
And the groups that were being armed were groups that we might loosely define as jihadist groups. Would you say that's fair, or would you say it's more complicated than that?
No, I'd say that it wasn't jihadist groups. So the Syrian opposition. So you had the initial civilian uprising. That's one thing. But once the war started, the armed opposition was based in sort of it was very much like a Sunni provincial uprising, and that characterized it. And in terms of politics, you have a lot of groups that are sort of apolitical but have like a Sunni identity to them and come from a conservative lower class parts of the country. Then you have Islamists, and then you have jihad, like you have the more extreme like transnational jihadists. The groups that the U.S. was particularly invested in were somewhere between the sort of apolitical, largely led by defectors from the Syrian army, and some Islamist groups. But like actual jihadist groups, the groups from like the Al Qaeda, Expanded Universe, and the Islamic State, like these groups were getting they had some connections with Qatar, and Turkey was definitely facilitating their growth just by keeping the borders open and allowing like Chechens, Uzbeks, or Western jihadis to flow in. But the groups that were actually like receiving, from what we can tell through open sources, the groups that were receiving Western aid or US aid were these more apolitical / loosely Islamist groups. Yeah, obviously this gets is a very heated conversation, but in terms of commentary. But from what, yeah, I've looked into what groups were receiving these, and that's my conclusion.
But this operation, I think it's important to emphasize, was done in conjunction with regional powers as well. I mean, one of the points I always try to make on this show, and perhaps you agree or disagree with it, is that often the U.S. intelligence apparatus in a place like the Middle East are relying heavily on references given to them by their peer organizations in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and places like that.
For sure. And these countries had been arming the opposition for a year or two prior to the start of the CIA giving lethal aid, and we're giving it to, the connections. Yeah, we're made through intelligence agents of Turkey, Qatar, Saudi, etc. And in a way, the U.S., because this was a covert operation, we still don't know a ton about it. But it seems like to me that the U.S. was trying to streamline support and sort of rationalize it, because initially you had these different intelligence agencies from these different countries creating their own relationships and supporting rivaling groups, streamline it, and then also try to rein in some of the more extreme groups that Turkey and Qatar were arming.
Right.
And I think you can talk about the efficacy of this program and stuff, and whether it was strengthening the more extreme groups by arming groups that were fighting alongside them. That's a whole other debate. What I was just trying to say earlier is that the specific groups the U.S. was arming were not the jihadists, essentially.
Right.
And one more thing also, like, that doesn't mean that these weren't groups that were committing abuses. Like, I think a lot of times people make this distinction. You see it a lot with, like, whether it's people who are like very much anti-opposition or pro-Kurdish, where if groups are committing abuses, therefore they're jihadists. But what essentially you had was like thousands of like 1,000+ militias formed. Some were followed like very austere forms of Sunni Islam. Some were essentially just local neighborhood militias that were headed by someone who became a warlord, who was like a local businessman. So yeah, I just wanted to make that distinction.
That's it. So that was one aspect of the U.S. intervention. What was the other aspect?
So the other aspect. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the other U.S. Intervention was headed by the Department of Defense, and this was the Train and Equip program, which initially had some overlap with. They were trying to arm, some opposition groups that of the armed opposition, the groups we were talking about earlier, to train these groups specifically, take them out of the country, and then put them back in. That side of it failed essentially completely. There was this whole fiasco where they sent 50 members, there's 50 guys that they trained in, and immediately they were surrendered or were forced to surrender to Nusra and turn over all their arms. The other part of the DoD program, which is the one that's like actually survived and been successful, is arming the YPG, what became the SDF, the main Kurdish militia within Syria. And that's the one that's survived to this day, that's still ongoing, though its rationale has become sort of confused, I think. Or it's not confused. It's always been against the Islamic State. It was finding a local partner force within Syria that could fight against the Islamic State. And they're still there. One of the main reason I think they're still there is because there's tens of thousands of former Islamic State members and their families that are being held in poorly resourced prisons under the Kurdish Autonomous Administration.
And I would probably add, the difference between the intervention in support of the YPG and other interventions was that the intervention in support of the YPG was largely a reactive measure following the fall of Mosul, if I'm not mistaken. That the United States was in essence facing humiliation, not only in Syria but in Iraq as well, and the YPG just happened to be the people on the ground that they could work with, as opposed to other operations which seem to have been more directed to creating a coherent opposition front out of this kind of milieu of different groups, as you say, like local militias, etc., etc.
Yeah. So it actually, the initial connection was related to the Islamic State attack on Sinjar, the Yazidi region within northwestern Iraq. That Islamic State was committing a genocide against the Yazidis there, and the YPG crossed the border and managed to protect some of the local population, and this was done in conjunction with the very first coordinated U.S. airstrikes with the YPG. And the relationship, I guess, was, from what I've read, developed through the PUK, which is kind of interesting. But yeah.
Yeah, so the Americans kind of got dragged into broader Kurdish politics, which of course the alliance with the YPG, unlike the alliance with other opposition forces which Turkey was backing, obviously had implications for Turkey's relationship with the United States, because the YPG is at the very least a fraternal organization with the PKK, which is the main insurgent group operating within Turkey as well. So obviously that complicated the United States position and has created this bizarro world where everybody pretends that there's no connection between the SDF, YPG, the alphabet soup that exists in Syria, and the organizations operating in Turkey and parts of northern Iraq. So you have this strange situation taking place right now.
Yeah, well, everyone pretends that except Turkey.
Which they're not wrong,
Yeah.
obviously.
No, they're not. They're not.
They're not wrong. They are clearly very closely related organizations, even if they don't operate as the same political party, which I don't think they do. In terms of ideology and personnel, there's like lots of overlaps.
Yeah, and I do think that there is sort of this narrative within the more YPG skeptical Western press that basically a bunch of PKK cadres entered Syria in 2012 and created this entity. But the PKK has been in Syria since essentially its founding in 1979. You had the PKK was founded amongst the left and Kurdish milieu in Turkey in the 70s, which is a pretty chaotic time politically. You had the 1980 coup, and then
they all went to
I think
Syria.
Before that, actually, I think in the months before Öcalan fled to Kobani, and then for the next 20 years they had their relationship with the Syrian regime, which allowed them to create very strong inroads within segments of the Kurdish population. So I think there is this criticism that it's artificial, but at this point it's very organic. It's a 40-year history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point to emphasize. I mean, the Syrian government turned a blind eye to the activities of the PKK for its own geostrategic interests. Öcalan was in the Bekaa Valley in Syrian-controlled Lebanon for years before he was eventually the Syrians forced him to leave under Turkish pressure. And the reason the YPG was able to emerge as a more coherent political force in the civil war was precisely because they were an organization that had roots on the ground and had decades of experience in that community. And so when the Syrian government withdrew from predominantly Kurdish regions, it left them under the control of these groups, which already had some kind of organizational basis, which that was not the same situation as in other parts of Syria.
Yeah, but I do want to say also that the Apochi, PKK strand within Kurdish politics in Syria is one of several.
Mm-hmm.
And you do have very strong Kurdish parties that are affiliated with the Barzanis or the Talibanis, the main parties in Iraqi Kurdistan that are part of this original lineage of Kurdish parties that were founded. The first one was founded in 1957, and there's the bifurcation. I think I've heard it put in some essay of the Kurdish movement between the KDP, the Barzani branch, and the PKK. That's very real within Kurdish politics within Syria as well, and very heated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also to be critical of very, sort of uncritical pro-Rojava Western sources like or people, etc. That political division within Syrian Kurdish society is very real, and yeah.
I mean the point
it gets ugly.
I mean the point I was making was that because the PKK had relations with the Syrian government and Syrian intelligence services, meant that they had a stronger organizational base on the ground to take advantage of that. Not
sure.
When compared to the other groups, pro-Barzani groups didn't have that same kind of organizational freedom, even if it was in the shadows, to organize and recruit people.
For sure. The PKK benefited up until 1998 greatly, and I've read historical accounts that in areas like Afrin and Kobani, the PKK was essentially almost running its own administration at points within that period, and was like a governing entity basically. But then the PKK was kicked out in 1998, and the PYD, which is the political party, sort of the PKK affiliated political party within Syria that was created in 2003, it was illegal then, and the regime repressed it alongside with the other parties, and the other parties also have their own dysfunctions. I think partially due to structural issues with being repressed for 60 or 40, 50 years, whatever. But also their basis in sort of more parochial interests and organized around more parochial lines instead of the PKK being a mass movement that was based on class politics.
Yeah, and it has like a very strong ideological, education that goes along with it, and has a very disciplined cadre, or at least comparatively well-disciplined cadre that could take advantage of that, take advantage of the political opportunity that they were, afforded during the Syrian civil war. But of course, that has also meant, I think, as you alluded to, there has been significant conflict between those pro-Barzani, let's say more traditionally nationalist factions of Kurdish politics who've been excluded from holding political power in the Kurdish-held regions of Syria, and the PYD, which functions as a state party, as it were.
Yeah, and it is interesting. It's in the West, it's anarchists that really gravitate towards the PKK in the post rally post Öcalan's arrest era. But the party, the movement really does still function, I think, in a Leninist way. It's very much like a vanguard of these cadres, and within the political system they've built, they've created all these this like hierarchy of what am I trying to say? Like
decision-making bodies.
They're communes, etc. But the party maintains a role in each of these. Like there's cadres at every level in these, and yeah, it's a vanguard party that's also trying to create like a bottom-up, revolutionize society.
Typical contradictions within a left political organization, because people who know the history of the PKK will be aware that back in the day it was one of the most centralized sort of Marxist-Leninist political parties. There was little tolerance for other Kurdish political groups, which were either crushed or absorbed into that party. So it's kind of strange watching anarchists wax lyrical about the anarchist project in Rojava, which I will give. There's obviously been significant gains, especially in fields such as women's rights and mass mobilization of people, but I think there is a little bit of mythologizing, because at the end of the day, this is a very poor rural region, and at the heart of what keeps it alive is a very centralized military structure under the command of a military commander who is, even if he's not officially the political leader, he's de facto the political leader of Rojava.
Yeah,
Mazlum Kobani, the commander, he's not officially the region's president or anything, but clearly he's the most significant individual there. Because
and he's a veteran PKK commander for decades. I guess something I did want to say is just we are, there is all this mythologizing about the autonomous administration, about the project, and it has its positives, it has its negatives, but right now I think it is very much long-term under great threat based, one, all its borders internationally are closed off, and it's in real sort of economic crisis, and this is exacerbating the political issues internally. With you have some parts of the population that are very bought into the system, and you have other parts, particularly in Arab areas like Deir ez-Zor, that are not really amenable to the politics, basically.
So, well, let's then shift focus then to talk about what the future is. So it looks like never say never. It looks like the Assad regime is staying. It looks like the international players are one by one recognizing that reality. Interests in Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Russia, they've shifted from what they were a decade ago. Even the United States, it seems to have like kind of just a policy that is based on, doesn't seem to have a long-term vision for anything. So are we approaching a conclusion to the Syria civil war? Is there a way for, firstly, the opposition-held areas in Idlib to return to government control? Will Turkey withdraw from those border regions that, it hasn't just occupied, you alluded to this, but, has functionally integrated into, the Turkish state, through turning them to basically sub-districts of Turkish provinces? Is there a Turkish withdrawal in the offing? And then what's the future of the Kurdish autonomous region, or the autonomous region of northeastern Syria?
Yeah, so in the short term, I do not see a political solution being reached. There's just too many issues, intractable issues between the actors that I don't really see being overcome. Though in the long term, I think definitely between the primary international actors, excluding the U.S., between Russia, Turkey, and increasingly the Arab League, the Gulf, there is a desire to reach a political solution that will be under the Assad regime. The U.S. does not have a long-term goal. The U.S. is there, as I alluded to earlier, because the tens of thousands of Islamic State fighters that are there, partially because if it withdraws, then it has zero say. It already has the political process has moved from the UN facilitated attempt at a political process to the Russian one that involves Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So the U.S. is out of that. So yeah, I don't know. I see desire for rapprochement. I just currently do not see how it's done. The main issues I'd say are that basically no one in opposition controlled territory wants to be under the regime and are like deathly afraid of living under the regime because they haven't done it for 10 years and they know that there are going to be repercussions whether or not they're civilian. And also Turkey. Erdogan's been flirting with the rapprochement, sort of pursuing it in the early stages. The opposition, or most of the opposition, I don't know if the HDP has actually voiced anything on this, but the CHP is very much pro rapprochement with the Assad regime. But the problem this leads to is Turkey's, one of their two primary goals is to prevent another flood of refugees in. If the Syrian regime at the moment takes Idlib or Turkey withdrawals, and then the regime slowly takes Idlib or the rest of opposition controlled territories, you're going to have thousands and thousands of people at the border wall that Turkey's put up trying to get into Turkey. So I think I don't know, that's still an issue that I don't really see how Turkey deals with that in the short term. I mean, they do kill people regularly at the border wall. You have across Syria, particularly in Idlib, and then in the northeast, people trying to cross the border wall to get into Turkey and eventually hope to get to the EU or whatever. And the Turkish gendarme regularly shoot and kill or beat and return these people. But the scale of this in the possible scenario we're talking would be massive. So I don't know. It's hard to see how this.
So Idlib is less of a sticking point for Turkey on the issue of, for example, Syrian sovereignty. Theoretically, they don't have a problem with perhaps Idlib returning to government control. Their issue, you would say, is they're fearful of the consequences for them in terms of refugee flows. And that's going to be a major sticking point because Turkey needs to have some kind of assurance that, if it withdraws its support from Idlib and government forces are allowed to take over, that they're not going to suddenly be faced with, 200,000 refugees desperately.
It would be closer to like 3 million, I think.
Oh, you think?
That's the population of Idlib, or the estimated population. And yeah, it would be a large amount of people trying to avoid returning to government control.
And you've mentioned a little earlier that the government, the Syrian government, is sort of inflexible, more inflexible, for example, than the Russians. I mean, you mentioned the reconciliation in the south. Is there no possibility of something like that taking place in Idlib province, perhaps, or is it, or are the is the bad blood between the two sides just too deep now, you would say?
So the reconciliation deals that were reached in the south, basically groups were given an option by Russia: either reconcile under the Syrian army, or you can leave to Idlib. So they could sort of separate out the more amenable ones like that. And so in Idlib, what you get is one, it's controlled by the former Nusra group, Tahrir Sham, which, politically really is not going to be able to see eye to eye with the regime. And then you have people that might not be, so a lot of them are not jihadists. Some of them are jihadists who've ended up in Idlib from other areas, but refuse to reconcile with the regime then. So, yeah, I don't really see how that could happen.
So there's basically there's kind of this impasse that just can't be overcome, at least in the short term, because whatever Turkey's desires to reconcile the fall of Idlib to the regime is going to open a whole can of worms with them, which of course Turkey doesn't want to deal with, given its economic crisis, the election season, the hot button topic of Syrian refugees. So it's kind of in a frozen state, as it were, and the regime doesn't really look like it's going to be, making overtures about being nice with the opposition. And not only that, the people who are in Idlib, the people in political power, are the most anti-regime people, not necessarily all jihadists, but just the people who are the most sort of firmly against the regime. So you have these kind of big structural problems that are going to that are just stymieing any kind of movement on the Idlib question.
Yeah, exactly.
So what about the Kurdish-held regions, or the SDF-held regions, which include, Syria's oil fields, as well as a lot of productive agricultural land, so they're economically important. People often say, "Oh, the Americans are stealing the Syrian oil." It's like, I don't think the Americans care about this. There's not that much oil, and
it's pretty low quality.
It's pretty low quality, and I think that's how they got Trump to reverse his withdrawal plan. They said, "Hey, you're going to give up some oil." And he was like, "Oh, no, I'm not going to give up that oil. That doesn't sound like the thing." But I don't think, people often frame it as there's some kind of deep economic reason for the United States there. But from what I understand, from what you've been saying, you think it's more like a kind of strategic level, a strategic level decision to stay in there, rather than like some petty scam to kind of plunder Syria's oil.
Well, I think strategic might make it sound like there's more of a rationale behind it. I think, there's, again, the presence of ISIS members, which there's been attempted jailbreaks, most famously last year in Hasaka, in one of the main cities controlled by the Autonomous Administration. So I think there is genuine fear of what happens if the U.S. withdraws, and then you have all these people that are poorly guarded, under resource prisons. What happens then? Then I think also there is just, the U.S. is there, so why they don't know what they're doing there, but they're not going to withdraw. Then there's the idea put forward by some hawks about countering Iran, that I think part of that might have just been to sell to Trump as well, for why to remain there. So yeah, it's not, other than the Islamic State presence, or specifically the imprisoned Islamic State members, it's the U.S. it's a little unclear what the U.S. is doing there.
So what do you think the fate of the autonomous region is in northeastern Syria? Is there, for example, given the historical connections between the YPG and the Syrian regime, is there a better chance of some kind of reconciliation? Would there be a possibility of some kind of recognition of some limited cultural autonomy in return for the Syrian government coming back into these regions? What might a long-term political solution look like? And how does Turkey factor into this again? Because Turkey occupies certain regions that had previously been under the control of the autonomous region, has a very hostile stance to the region. There was a lot of talk of a potential another Turkish invasion, although I think that's receded because not only because of the earthquake, but I think also because they didn't really get American backing, and the autonomous region was very dovish in their willingness to talk on these issues. So I think they did quite well in DC in that sense. But what does the future for the region look like? You mentioned earlier that you think it's under threat. What are the options of what might happen?
So the way I see it, basically, there's three options for the autonomous administration. One is the U.S. stays there indefinitely, permanently, and that will ensure autonomy, ensure the survival of the political project. Two, and this would be, I guess, it's probably the best one. Well, I again, this doesn't. Okay, so basically, the PKK peace process gets restarted. Turkey's approach to the YPG, to the SDF, autonomous administration, etc., is desecuritized, and then that greatly lessens the Turkish threat to the project. But that would be more. That still wouldn't factor in an end goal. And then the last one is reaching some sort of reconciliation deal with the regime. But I mean, there's been negotiations ongoing for years between representatives of the project and the regime, and they've never been able to reach any sort of deal regarding military status, political status, and even I think cultural rights. From what I've heard, the regime, for decades, the regime had banned any sort of cultural rights for Syria's Kurds, and they do not want to recognize, these sort of things still.
So it's all still up in the air. I mean, there's a possibility that the United States will stay there indefinitely because, sometimes things just get entrenched and never move, right?
Yeah, and the U.S. presence there is quite small. It's like a couple of hundred, or it's like I think maybe close to 1,000 soldiers from what we know, and it's purely a military presence. Like politically, they have not recognized the autonomous administration. They try to avoid, as best they can, dealing with the autonomous administration in any sort of political matters. Usually when you see members, usually it's like U.S. military generals or etc. meeting with, Muslim Kobani. It's yeah, so it's pretty purely a military role, and it's pretty small. It's a couple of big bases. Yeah.
And some tanks on the oil fields. So long term, medium term, you're not really hopeful for any kind of comprehensive solution to the Syrian civil war. Do you think we're just going to continue on in this kind of stalemate for the time being? Then is that your kind of general feeling on this? There's a kind of inertia. Assad may get normalized, but there's going to be parts of the country that he just doesn't control.
Yeah, I guess the best I can see, or the most likely, medium term at least. That's what it is. I mean, I think there is politically, there definitely are. There is a push from Turkey and Russia on the Gulf towards some sort of normalization, but yeah, the facts on the ground still sort of prohibit that from actually occurring anytime soon.
And the regime has leverage as well.
I mean, it is, broke and under all these sectoral sanctions, but politically, it definitely has leverage, and over the other internal actors, over the opposition, over the SDF, it definitely has leverage as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of in this limbo state, as it were, where it's like, as you say, it's under terrible economic stress, which is obviously affecting the entire country, but it doesn't really have a political incentive to reach some kind of comprehensive solution because it feels it's won the civil war and it's been vindicated, and the price of other countries abandoning their support for the Syrian regime could be, restarting the civil war, could be, new refugee flows, because obviously the civil war, as we've alluded to in this conversation, has like implications far beyond Syria itself. So they kind of they have a hand to play in this whole thing.
Yeah, and Russia and Iran are both quite invested at this point. I mean, both are obviously countries that are in quite difficult situations at the moment, but Iran's been heavily invested since the beginning, because to lose Syria would, well, one, it's important for power projection throughout the region. It's an important link with its connection to Hezbollah in terms of logistics. And yeah, so it has that support no matter what. Now it's gaining more potential political support through these talks that keep sort of accelerating, but at a still small pace.
Well, Alex, thank you for your time this evening. I'm going to put a link to your Substack in the description so people can follow your work on there. Is there anywhere else anything you would like to plug? Anywhere else people can find you?
So definitely Twitter at akmckeever at akmckeever. And then I'm a part-time researcher for a Syrian NGO, Syrians for Truth and Justice. I do a lot of open source stuff, so a lot of geolocations. So yeah, that's the primary places you can find me.
Well, once again, thank you very much for coming on, talking about this very complicated story. I hope viewers were able to follow everything, because the Syrian civil war is, let's just say, very confusing if you're just trying to look at it on the surface, because there's so many different players. And with that, as we say on TAR, we are out.